Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Serena Farrow.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 3 minutes past 8 here on LBC. Well, as you've probably got used to by now, we are every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 o'clock. We're interviewing a senior politician and taking your calls as well. First half an hour, just me and the politician. Tonight, it's Caroline Lucas, Green Party candidate and former leader of the Greens. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next Tuesday, actually, we're going to be taking the ITV debate next Tuesday, but next Thursday, we'll have Anne Widdecombe from the Brexit Party in the chair. So that's something for us all to look forward to, isn't it? I'm sure you'd love to ask her a question or two. Right, let's, by the way, you can watch us on YouTube, on Facebook, on our Twitter feed, or at the LBC website, lbc.co.uk. I'm intrigued by something that you've organised called Dear Leavers. What is that?
What Dear Leavers is a kind of a project of my going to some of those communities that voted Leave to hear directly from them about what issues motivate them. Yes, why they voted to leave, but that's not the first question that we ask. But it felt particularly important coming from Brighton, which was obviously a very strong Remain area. I want to try to explore how we can bring the country back together and try to understand more about the motivations behind Leave. And of course, a lot of people were motivated simply because they don't believe that the EU should have the role that it does in our lives. But I think what I discovered going to places like Dudley and Huddersfield and Swindon and others was for a lot of people, there is just this real sense of not having a say over their lives. And that can be in something as simple as, you know, the shape of their high street, the fact that the bank's gone, the post office has gone, the key anchor shops have gone. Just that sense of feeling that politics has been done to them. And that matters to me because although the Green Party is a very strongly Remain party, by saying that, we're not saying turn the clock back 3.5 years and pretend that the Leave vote never happened. What we want to do is to try to remain and transform our country, to make power be devolved throughout our nations in a much fairer way, to try to address the inequality that is a stain, I think, on our country, and just to find what we have in common with people who voted Leave. And of course, there'll be things that we disagree about, but through doing this process, actually, I think I have come to a stronger understanding about some of the reasons that people voted to leave. And the idea that you would just revoke, I mean, the Lib Dem policy just simply saying
we'll come on to that in a moment. But just on that, I'm trying to put myself in the position of somebody that you will have met in Huddersfield, Swindon, wherever. And what I would say to you, given what you've just said, and I think my first response would be, yes, I do feel let down by the political system in all sorts of ways, but I particularly feel let down by the fact that MPs like you have stopped us leaving the European Union. It's something that I, in the referendum, thought that I was having a real influence over. It was a binary decision, yes or no. We were told the government would implement what we decided. And yet you're disrespecting that by arguing for a second referendum.
And some people have, as you can imagine, did indeed
probably
say that to me.
Probably in very forcible terms, I imagine.
What I would say to that is that although it sounded as if that referendum was very simple, what we have discovered since is that there is no agreed definition of what that Brexit is. And the fact that, you know, you've got Nigel Farage saying originally that the Boris Johnson version of Brexit was absolutely not Brexit. And you had Boris Johnson for a while saying Theresa May's version of Brexit really wasn't Brexit. And there are, I think you would concede, a number of different definitions of Brexit out there. And I think one of the problems is that there was no shared understanding of what that would actually mean, practically speaking. And so my position of saying it should go back to the people, and not only that it should go back to the people, but it should go back to the people in such a way that Parliament doesn't have an opportunity to get involved again. It's the so-called Kyle Wilson amendment. It was an amendment that the Labour MPs, Peter Kyle and Phil Wilson, suggested, whereby whatever verdict is made in that second referendum goes straight into legislation. It doesn't. So you get away from these very legitimate concerns. I understand people saying, "Oh, well, you'll have a third referendum, you'll have a fourth one, a fifth one."
Well, let me put myself back into that position, and I'm going to be from Swindon, I think, because that is a key marginal seat in Swindon, which Labour need to win if they're to get back in power. I think I would say to you in those circumstances, well, what question would you be asking in the referendum? Because if you're going to ask a question as to Boris Johnson's deal versus Remain or a Jeremy Corbyn deal versus Remain, I might well think that isn't Brexit. I might want it to be, might want no deal on the ballot paper. But you probably, Tony Blair has actually said he would agree to that. What's your view on that?
I'm very nervous about putting no deal on the table. If that's the only thing that was out there that had been negotiated, if we had no other deal, that's the only thing we could put on the ballot paper. I would much prefer to put something on the ballot paper that, for example, that might be the Boris Johnson version, because that is something that has been negotiated. We know that the EU agrees with it. We know that there's a body of politicians in this country that agree with it. So it has a level of buy-in from people who want Brexit.
No, that absolutely should be on the ballot paper. But what I'm saying is if people come to accept that there has to be a second referendum, because there'll be a lot of people that say, well, we shouldn't be having this referendum, they have got to buy into it. They've got to regard it as a legitimate referendum. So the question that asked is really important, I think. So, I've always said if there was to be one, you should do a rerun of the original referendum first. So you gauge how public opinion has changed, if at all. And then if Leave won that again, then you would have a second question, deal or no deal. Mm-hmm. Now, to me, as somebody who voted Leave, who doesn't want a second referendum, but if there was one, I could accept that as a fair way of doing it.
I could live with that. It would not be my preferred option, because I am deeply concerned about what no deal would do to this country, and just trying to represent my constituents and the concerns that I know so many people would have about that. I think it's dangerous, as we've found out, putting things on referenda that you're not going to carry through, and so you'd have to say, yes, I would carry that through. And so reluctantly, if that was the only option, that's the only consensus we could get.
But a referendum is so dangerous that you want another one.
No, I think when we had the first referendum, no one was talking about no deal, were they? This is the whole point that I'm making.
They were.
They weren't.
David Cameron, as Prime Minister, he raised it during the campaign. He said, if there is no deal, we will go to WTO rules. I can drag out the quotes if you like.
So there might be 2 or 3 quotes, but essentially the big debate was, whether or not we'd be part of the single market or not, whether or not we'd be part of the customs union. People weren't really saying that we would just fall out with no deal at all. That was very rarely mentioned. But as I say, I'm not ruling out what you've suggested. I'm just simply saying that wouldn't be my first preference.
The last time we spoke, we talked a little bit about the Progressive Alliance from the last election, and I think you said to me, and I think this was on air, and I'm not betraying any confidence. I hope I'm not. Anyway,
I'll let you know.
You said to me that you thought the Greens had been a little bit too generous in those negotiations, and that if the implication was that you'd been a bit done over.
Yeah.
Now, aren't you a bit afraid that history has repeated itself, where you're standing down, I think I'm right in saying, in 51 seats in favour of Plaid or the Liberal Democrats? Liberal Democrats are standing down in 9. Now, to me, that means that you've got the worst part of the deal here.
Well, I'm glad that you are fighting our corner on this. And we would have liked more, obviously, but there had to be some recognition of the fact that the Liberal Democrats are the bigger party. They have how many MPs now? When I last looked,
20.
About 20. Yep. To the Green Party's 1. And so we understood that there would need to be some differential between what the two parties got. We negotiated very hard. I would love to have got more from it, obviously. Even more, I would love to have had the Labour Party around the table. That's what would have been the real game changer. And of course, Labour won't engage in those discussions. They won't stand candidates aside. So they were never going to get involved. But it would have been a lot more impactful, I think, if they had.
If you just want to put your headphones on a second, I want to play you a clip from an interview that you gave not that long ago to joe.co.uk.
Position of revoke at that point, I just felt this is just taking party interest above national interest to such I think an unforgivable degree, to be honest. I think if you wanted to send a message to 17.4 million people but you don't give a about what they just said, why don't you just say so?
Caroline Lucas, you potty mouth.
Well, to be in my defence, I didn't realise that bit was being recorded. So although I stand by the sentiment of what I said just then... But you see,
this is what I find fascinating. You're having a right old go at the Liberal Democrats there, and you did at the beginning of the programme as well, and yet you're going into this Remain alliance with them, even though you disagree with their fundamental approach to Brexit.
Wait a minute, I don't agree with their fundamental approach to Brexit, because I don't really think that Jo Swinson is going to wake up and be Prime Minister on December the 13th. And that policy of revoke, which I do passionately disagree with, only happens if the Lib Dems get a majority. They form the government. And I don't think that's terribly likely, and I don't suppose you do either. So short of Jo Swinson being Prime Minister, the position of the Lib Dems is for a people's vote. I was one of the co-founders of the People's Vote. The Lib Dems have been very involved in that campaign. And so on that issue, which I think is the far more likely area of where we're going to come together rather than the Lib Dems being a majority government, we can agree.
But if she did win the election, which I know, okay, we can both agree that that's not going to happen. But if she did and introduced revoked legislation, what would you do?
Well, if she had a majority in the government, there's nothing I could do, is there?
But would you vote for it or against it?
No, I would still vote against it.
Okay.
But if she had a majority in the government, it would still go through. But I really think that, I know, it's your job to, posit unlikely things, but I think a majority Lib Dem government is pretty unlikely.
We can agree on that. Why are you standing against the new Speaker of the House of Commons? Well, weren't you aware that you were?
I think my slightly confused face probably betrays the fact that I wasn't entirely sure that
it's a bit odd,
that we
isn't
were.
it? Because the convention is
that
you
don't. I can't answer that question, and I will go away and find out exactly what the thinking was. What I can tell you is that it is a decision of our local parties, so we don't impose candidates nationally. I wasn't consulted about whether or not we should have stood against the Speaker, and I personally, broadly speaking, think it's probably quite a good convention that you don't stand against the Speaker, because the Speaker can't campaign on their own behalf. They have to be neutral on behalf of of Parliament. But as I say, it's a decision of the local party, and if that's what they've decided, then that's where.
Just a final question before we move on to environmental issues. The Remain Alliance, it's fundamentally undemocratic, isn't it? Because what you're urging people to do is not vote for the party that they really want to vote for. In fact, you're denying people the chance to vote Green in 51 different constituencies. You're asking them to vote for a party that they don't agree with just because you want to stop Brexit.
I would say that the Remain Alliance is the best we can make of a horribly undemocratic electoral system that is forcing us to try to find ways of not splitting votes between smaller parties. And the reality is that we have this very undemocratic first-past-the-post system. It can give you a majority government. You can get 55% of the seats on 35% of the vote. That is fundamentally unfair. So although I massively regret the fact that there'll be places around the country where people can't vote Green, I think hopefully most of them will recognise that the price that they're paying, in a sense, is for the right for other people who do vote Green to actually try to get those votes turned into seats. Because in the European elections, 2 million people voted Green. In the general election of 2015, 1 million people voted Green. Still only one MP. That is vastly undemocratic and means that the vast majority of people who vote Green know that under first past the post, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to get Greens elected.
But what do you say to Green Party supporters and members in Totnes, which is it's quite a Green area in many ways, but the Green candidate there has been asked to stand aside for Sarah Wollaston, who until recently was a Conservative MP.
By whom?
Sorry?
Asked by...
What, the Green candidate is standing aside because it's part of the Remain Alliance?
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, Green supporters in Totnes are going to feel pretty bad about that, aren't they?
But every decision that's been made when it comes to the local Green parties has been made by the local party. So it has been proposed as part of this alliance that will be one of the seats that will be covered. And then they have a vote of the local Green Party to decide whether or not to go ahead and do that. And there were some places that were proposed where the Green Party has just said, no, we're not going to stand aside. So it was a democratic decision. And I know it is really difficult. The Green Party stands in, what we're here for is because we believe we've got a distinctive message that we want to get into places of influence and power. That's the point of the Green Party. So it is massively difficult to make these decisions.
Let's move on to those messages. I'm sure people will want to talk much more about Green Party policies than maybe the Remain Alliance when we come to calls. 0345 6060 973. If you would like to ask Caroline Lucas a call, I'm just looking at the calls coming in so far. Actually, most of them are about the Remain Alliance, but we'll get some more on policy. Okay. Well, let's start on an announcement that I think was made yesterday when Jonathan Bartley said that the Green Party would appoint a carbon chancellor to allocate the £100 billion a year that you've pledged for tackling the climate emergency if you were elected to power. Now, we don't expect, I don't think you would expect
less likely than Jo Swinson even.
Well, I'm glad you said that and not me. Now, £100 billion a year. I mean, that is a seventh or an eighth of the entire public expenditure of the UK government. Now, presumably that's going to have to be borrowed.
the vast majority of that, I think about £91 billion indeed, will be borrowed, but it's being borrowed to invest. That's the difference.
Well,
it's
that's the
being borrowed
catchphrase
for
that all
assets.
the parties are using now,
Well,
isn't
it
it?
is
I mean, you're
different,
following
isn't
Ed
it?
Balls' economic policy, basically. No, it's not borrowing because it's about sort of infrastructure or whatever. It's investment.
If you borrow in order to get a mortgage for a house, then you end up with an asset, don't you? That's different from borrowing in order to go and, have a big party somewhere where there's nothing to show
What
for it at the
asset
end
are you
of it.
getting in return for the $100 billion?
Well, you're getting a hugely upgraded green transport system. You're getting loads of much more low emission buses and greener trains. You're getting every single home in Britain
That's
properly
already happening,
insulated.
isn't it?
Well, nothing like the speed that it needs to. The whole point is that if we're saying that there is a climate emergency, then we need to be acting far more quickly than we are. The government admits there's a climate emergency, and then it says, but we're going to try and reach net zero emissions by 2050. That's 30 years away. That's like saying, there's a fire, I'm going to dial 999 and ask for a fire engine in 30 years' time. I mean, we have to act fast. And when you have, as we have done just this week, 11,000 global scientists saying that we risk what they called untold human suffering, and that the next 10 years are going to be critical in terms of whether or not we make the decisions that are necessary to get off the collision course with climate catastrophe, then we need to be rising to this challenge of the climate emergency with the same kind of motivation and mobilization that we would have to any other massive security risk. If it was the Second World War, if it was bailing out the banks, we found the money in the past. And it feels to me that if what is at stake is the livability of the planet, the idea that we kind of sit around saying, well, I'm not sure that we can afford it, would seem a bit weird to future generations who probably wouldn't forgive us.
The trouble is, though, that there are people who think, well, this is all an exaggeration, that this climate emergency, it's all a bit of a put-up job. And the reason that some people think that is because I discovered, in the research for writing a book that I'm doing, that in 1989 the United Nations issued a paper saying, well, if we haven't solved this before the year 2000, I mean, it's too late by then. And we've had these warnings over all that time, and I mean, we haven't had the cataclysm yet. Now, I accept.
Have you looked at the TV recently? The world is on fire from the Arctic to the Amazon, Australia. You've just seen those fires that are now unprecedented in Australia.
But you talk as if we've never had those fires before.
But the frequency of them, I think, is something.
And you're attributing
really
all
different.
of that to climate change?
No, of course I'm not. I don't think anybody can. But I think you can say that the speed with which these are now happening, where once in what was supposed to be once in 100-year events are now happening once every couple of years, then that is entirely commensurate with all of the concerns that the scientists have told us. And 11,000 global scientists just this week. I mean, I don't know the UN report that you're talking about, but it feels to me that there is so much consensus now. I think there's far less of a debate about whether climate change is happening. There's far more of a debate
I'm
about
absolutely
how
not
to deal
arguing
with it.
about that, but it's just that when people see these warnings have been issued before and then it doesn't happen, they sort of start to get a little bit sceptical and think, well, is it really the emergency that we're expected to spend £100 billion a year
But if
on?
what you're getting for that £100 billion, for example, is properly insulating every home in Britain so we don't have thousands of people dying prematurely every year in, what is it, the fifth or sixth richest country in the world because they can't afford to keep their homes warm. If you're getting things out of that are in any case a no regrets policy, then, I mean, I disagree with you, obviously. I do think it's an emergency, but even if it weren't, it feels to me that we're getting some very positive things as a result.
I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm not saying that I'm taking a view one way or the other, but I do think that you have a big convincing job to do. I
don't think we do, to be honest.
Do you not?
I mean, there's so much evidence now that over, I think it was something like 53% of the population say that climate change is one of the top three issues that's going to motivate the way they vote at this next election.
But when you were going around these Leave constituencies, was anybody themselves bringing up climate change as an issue with you?
To be fair, some of them were,
Okay.
yes. No, they were. I do think there's been a change.
But if we can all agree that rail travel is a more environmentally friendly form of travel than going by road. The rail system needs a lot of investment, but you're calling for HS2 to be scrapped. Why would you do that?
Because I think if you're looking to how you can best spend, it's around 80 billion at the moment, then doing it for a railway that is going to cut across swathes of ancient woodland, that is going to shave off, is it about 20 minutes from the route from the north down to London, that doesn't feel to me that it's going to give you the best benefit when you could be putting that money into more rural rail services, the kind of rail services that people depend on just to get to work on a day-to-day basis, rather than the people who are commuting down to London and want to get there 20 minutes sooner.
So are you suggesting new rural rail lines?
Sorry?
New rural rail lines.
I think there are probably a number of rail lines that could be reopened, yes, as well as.
Well, I agree with
creating
you,
new
but
ones.
they would cut through swathes of woodland as well, wouldn't they?
Well,
I mean,
there is-
whenever you build transport infrastructure, inevitably there is
That
going to be a cost.
Certainly true, but I think most people would say that the HS2, the size and the scale of that is going to have a very, very significant imprint in terms of ancient woodland in particular.
And again, if you were being consistent on being environmentally friendly, surely you should be embracing nuclear power. Because
if nuclear power were absolutely necessary, if you were giving me the choice, do I want fossil fuels or do I want nuclear power, I could concede to you that we would have to go for nuclear. But I don't think that new nuclear power is necessary. There are estimations that have been done by people like the Centre for Alternative Technology and other climate modelling that has been done to show that you can get to your net zero by 2030 without nuclear. And of course it's hard, and it depends a heck of a lot on massive energy efficiency and massive reductions of material throughput. It does mean bigger changes, but I would like to try to do that without needing new nuclear, because new nuclear is very slow, it's very costly, and it's very centralised. And what we know that we need in terms of an energy grid for the future is that it's going to be far more decentralised.
But apart from the waste side of it, which I accept is quite an important part of it, apart from that, it is incredibly environmentally friendly, isn't it? And the science proves it.
I think we could probably have a debate about uranium extraction and how environmentally friendly that is. I mean, I appreciate, every big technology, whether that's wind turbines or solar panels or anything else, has an environmental footprint. But it feels to me with nuclear, it's certainly not, completely carbon neutral. And I would come back to this point about centralisation, cost and speed. We know, at least those of us who believe what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is saying, that the next 10 years is going to be crucial. And the nuclear power stations that are being planned right now are massively over budget, they're massively over time. They're not getting us the energy reduction or the switch away from fossil fuels that we need anything like fast enough.
What's your view on how far we're progressing with sustainable forms of energy, wind power, solar power? I mean, there were figures that have come out in the last 6 months where we're now, we're not using coal at all, often in our power basket, and renewables are becoming increasingly important. But you can never power an economy 100% through renewals, can you?
It depends whether you're importing them. It depends whether or not you've got those interconnectors with other parts of of Europe, in our case, where you could import renewable energy from countries that might have a surplus when we don't. If we've got the point where the wind isn't blowing and the sun's not shining, then battery technology is going to be massively important. Interconnectors are being incredibly important. The stuff that I have read suggests to me that you could do it that way, as long as you've got enough battery storage capacity and as long as you've got enough interconnectors.
When I was at school, visual pollution was considered sort of equally bad as air pollution, noise pollution and whatever. I regard onshore wind farms as really ugly things. Now, some people think that they're really beautiful. I completely accept that. But do you want to see the Yorkshire moors festooned with wind power?
No, I much prefer to see offshore wind, which you will point out to me is more expensive. But if you ask me, would I like to see a nuclear power station on the Yorkshire moors, or would I like to see lots of wind turbines, I can tell you I prefer to see the wind turbines.
Let's talk a little bit about Extinction Rebellion, because I think their initial round of protests got a lot of public support. They engendered a debate which maybe we hadn't had on the subject in that depth. So I think from that point of view, they were remarkably successful. But this latest round of protests, I just wonder whether they've damaged their cause. And you look at the incident in Canning Town where protesters were dragged off a Jubilee line train, an electric train, I think it was, or was it the DLR? I can't remember, but it was an environmentally friendly train. And you think, well, what was the point of that? They were trying to inconvenience a huge number of people. It got all a bit out of hand. It got a little bit nasty. And do you not think they're in danger of losing public support with stunts like that?
I think that stunt was massively unwise, and I think they did lose support from it. I think that as I understand it, and I don't fully understand all of the governance structures within XR, because obviously it is a grassroots movement and there's not one person kind of leading it. But as I understand, a lot of people within the XR movement did express deep concern about this stunt happening, but a small number went off and did it anyway. But I would certainly agree with you that if we wanted to send a message to say that, we don't care about working people just trying to get to work, that's a pretty bad message to send. And it was hugely unwise. We need good public transport, and the tube is a pretty good example of good public transport.
I was watching your interview with Andrew Marr on Sunday, and you looked visibly shocked when he asked you if you ever flew, and you said yes, you did. You went to America to visit your son.
I was shocked, but
to me, you did look quite shocked that he would ask that. And there's been quite a lot of comment on that since. Now, personally, I don't think that anybody should be prevented from visiting their family, but people have accused you of being a hypocrite for travelling by air.
If I was saying to everyone else, you can't travel by air, but I'm going to, I would absolutely agree. That would be extremely hypocritical. I don't think I am saying that. I think what I'm saying is that we need to shift to a situation whereby, for example, if you're travelling within Europe, it is massively more expensive to go by train than it is to fly. And so that's a result, a deliberate choice of not taxing aviation fuel, not putting VAT on planes, and yet we're making rail 3 times more expensive. So what I want to see is, to the extent possible, and obviously if you're trying to get to America, it's an awful lot harder, but certainly within Europe, let us try to make it such that travelling by train, travelling by the more environmentally friendly method, is cheaper than the alternative.
But presumably you'd want to tax air travel a lot more, which inevitably would affect people on the lower end of the pace. I mean, people who've been used to going on maybe a couple of nice holidays a year to Europe, they might feel that you wouldn't be able to do that.
Well, if they were going to Europe, then I hope that our policies around making the train a heck of a lot cheaper would help. I appreciate it takes longer, and there may still be people who can't use that as an option. But I think just talking to people that I come across, an awful lot of people are put off by going by train more by the price than by anything else. The frequent flyer levy is the fairest policy that I've come across that tries to address this fact, because the evidence suggests that it's about 15% of the population who takes 70% of the flights. Therefore, a family who's going, is flying to Europe in a green government world would still be able to do that. It's the people that are flying not just once or twice a year, but once, twice, 3 times a month.
So what would the barrier be? Sort of if you travel more than 10,000 miles, you get an extra levy, or would it be done by frequency of flights? How would that work?
I mean, obviously, you'd have to cross-reference the. I suppose it would be done by the carbon intensity. I mean, it's the principle that I'm trying to establish at the moment, that those people who fly most would pay an awful lot more than those people who fly least. But you're right; it would also have to factor in.
They do already, don't they, through the tax?
Not an awful lot more, no, slightly more. And what I take the point that the distance that they're flying also needs to be factored in. But you can do that. Those websites that already help you offset your flight to take those into account.
Isn't the problem here that there's too much stick and not enough carrot? If you're going to try and persuade people to change their behaviour, they've got to understand why it's a good thing that they do. And I mean, we all look at our own patterns of behaviour here. Now, I deliberately now try to buy things that don't have a lot of plastic packaging on them, something I wouldn't have thought about 3 or 4 years ago. I actually do go by train more now. If I was going to a party conference in Manchester, I would have always driven up the M6 because I like my own company, I can do what I like. But I now go by train. And it's almost a subliminal thing that people just get used to it once they've changed. Yep. Rather than saying, well, we're going to slap a new tax on this, a new tax on that, we're going to make you do this or make you do that. That's not the way to do it, is it?
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, I think one of the reasons that so often the debate about climate ends up talking about flying is because at the moment it's very difficult to come up with the alternatives, certainly for long-haul flights. But I completely agree with you, which is why I'm saying that, for example, when it comes to travelling within the UK or between the UK and Europe, then making the railways much cheaper and flights much more expensive is one way to incentivise people to do the right thing. Or when you're buying your coffee, and if you take your reusable mug, that's now going to make your coffee cheaper. So those kinds of signals, I think, are massively important. And I couldn't agree more that what we need to do is to paint a picture of a greener world that is actually attractive rather than one that looks like it's hair shirts and shivering around a candle in a cave and is not attractive to anybody.
Well, I've become so engrossed in our conversation that I've lost track of time because we've got to go late to the news. It's 8:32. Serena Farrow has the news headlines.
The Health Secretary says the government's putting record amounts of funding in the NHS as latest figures show A&E waiting times are at their worst ever. Well, last month alone, 1 in 6 patients in England were forced to wait for more than 4 hours. Both Labour and the Liberal Democrats have criticised the Tories' record on healthcare. Authorities, meantime, say a second victim of a shooting at a high school in the Los Angeles area has died. A student's also been arrested after at least 5 people have been injured in California. And a man's been arrested at Heathrow Airport on suspicion of Syria-related terror offences. The 26-year-old arrived on a flight from Turkey earlier today. LBC weather, rain and hill snow for England and Wales, clearing though into northern England. A warning of icy patches around with a low of -3 degrees.
Election 2019. Continuous coverage on LBC.
I've always loved a kitchen experiment, especially smoothies. I've blended all sorts of mad combinations. Strawberry and charcoal, broccoli and chocolate. Not my best, that. But when I test blenders in the Witch Lab, it's not about flavour, it's about performance. Our tests use proper tough stuff, hard ice, strong veg, rough nuts. And the blenders that can hack it are the only ones we recommend for your kitchen.
Which tests harder so you can buy smarter. Visit which.co.uk.
Some regard me as a national treasure. Well, that's very kind of you, but let me tell you about a hidden national treasure. Cello TVs. Cello are the only British manufacturer of premium quality LED TVs, but without the hefty price tag. 16 to 65 inches, manufactured in the UK, there's a Cello TV for everyone. Get a 65-inch smart 4K TV for under £550. Search cello.tv.
You're in leakage, you're in leakage.
Tenna Men. Pants and pads. Buy online or in shops. Tenna Men. Keep control.
Sharing credit card details on scraps of loose paper. Finding battered receipts in the wash. Stressing out your accountant. Expense management doesn't have to be stuck in the dark ages. Say hello to Soldo, company cards that do your expenses for you. Give your team prepaid cards to simply spend, snap the receipt, and that's that. Spend smarter. See the light at soldo.com.
Make their Christmas wishes come true. Whether they want to jet off on Barbie's dream plane, run with the storm in Fortnite, or glide along on My Lovely Llama. At littlewoods.com, you'll find all the toys they love, all with inclusive delivery and free returns. Own Christmas. Shop now at littlewoods.com.
We live in an age where you can stream any box set instantly. But staying on top of our pensions is anything but instant. PensionBee can transfer most old pensions together into one simple online plan, so you can manage your pension on your smartphone as simply as streaming that box set. Download the app or visit pensionbee.com today.
Authorised and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. Capital at risk.
Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:36. If you'd like to watch us, you can do so via the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, the Facebook page, YouTube channel or Twitter feed. And keep your calls coming. We have 2 lines free at the moment, 0345 6060 973. Let's start the questions to Caroline Lucas with Charles in Derby. Hello, Charles.
Hello, thanks for taking my call.
Hi, what would you like to ask?
So I live in Derby North, which is an extremely marginal seat between the the Labour Party and the Tory Party. I understand the Greens are fielding a paper candidate in Derby North. I wondered if Caroline Lucas would consider stepping aside to make sure the vote isn't split, so we can ensure that we retain a Labour seat.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy with your question, Charles. Ultimately, it is down to the local party whether or not they stand, and you'll probably
too late now anyway because nominations closed at 4.
At 4 o'clock. So even if I were minded to, it's too late to persuade them. And I guess just to try to answer your frustration, because I do understand it, I would simply say that we have stood down in a number of seats, a good number of seats. Both in 2017, we stood down in over 40 seats, and this time around we've stood down in some seats as part of the so-called Unite to Remain alliance, but we've also stood down unilaterally in a number of Labour seats. But at the end of the day, there has to be some reciprocity from Labour, and it is so frustrating that they would not come to the table to have some discussions with us because, we stand for a reason. We stand because we want to get green votes, because green votes can either get people elected or even in a place like Derby North, where, as you say, it's unlikely that the Greens can get elected there right now. What it can do is send a signal. If we get 1 million green votes, for example, across the country, that's important because the climate needs those votes to underline its significance. So I'm sorry in that case that you feel frustrated about that. And I would just point to the fact that more than any other party, the Green Party has been standing aside. But at the end of the day, we've got an important message to get across as well. And if we could just harness people's frustration about this instead to kind of changing the electoral system so we didn't have to do it, that would be a very good thing.
How many seats are you standing in? Do you know?
We're standing in 500.
Right.
Just got that
so
today.
More than the Brexit Party.
Yes.
Charles, thank you for that. Chris is in Scarborough. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Ian. Hello, Caroline.
Hello, Chris.
I was an active member of the Green Party for about 12 years. It slowly dawned upon me that you're not really a Green Party, but an ultra-red party. I particularly don't understand how you reconcile your support for the population explosion, currently running at 1 million every 2 or 3 years, depending whether you want to count all the illegals, with protection for animal and plant habitats.
Well, I would
How do you reconcile that?
I would say that the Green Party is, I think, the only party that actually has a population policy, which is not a policy that says thou shalt only have, 1 child or 2 children or anything like that. But it is a policy that says talking about population growth needs to be part of the debate, because you're quite right that one of the factors on environmental impact is not just numbers alone, but more importantly, numbers plus the type of consumption patterns of the people who are here and the technologies. So basically, population isn't a question of just numbers; it's a question of consumption patterns too. But that said, you're right, that is a factor that needs to be discussed, and the Green Party does.
But in terms of immigration, just playing devil's advocate here, the more people that come into the country, and at the moment we're effectively building a city the size of Sheffield every single year, that requires more infrastructure, it requires more buildings, and therefore you could term immigration as being very environmentally unfriendly.
I mean, I disagree with that. In terms of the Green Party's policy, we would, we support freedom of movement. So under the EU, we think freedom of movement has been a positive thing. And obviously freedom of movement is a two-way process too. So plenty of people from the UK are living in Spain and France and elsewhere. When it comes to the broader immigration policy, I think what our policy is basically about is having what we would say is a more humane policy. I think it's quite wrong that, for example, if you have a right to asylum here or a right to be a refugee here, that you're not allowed to bring over here, a grown-up child. So if the child that you're trying to reunite with is over 18, you have no right to do that. So I don't think we should be splitting families up. But I think a humane immigration policy is a fair policy and one that we should support. But you haven't really answered the point, have you? The more people come in, the more infrastructure you need, the more raw materials you need to build the infrastructure, the more energy you need to build the infrastructure. Therefore, that in itself is environmentally unfriendly. Well, if we were moving to a greener economy and a greener society, the impact of that would be far less. And we're not talking about an open borders policy. We're not talking about a policy that is going to mean that we're going to have a lot more people. If you're asking me, do I think we should be putting our borders up, then I think the negative impacts of that are far greater than the environmental impacts that you're describing.
But how many people do you think, bearing in mind that a lot of people think the country is full up already, which I always argue against, just fly from London to Edinburgh, you can see that there is a lot of space there, and I'm not advocating on building on every green field, but how many would you think is reasonable per year? What we've got now, or would you increase that?
I think there would be a small increase, because what I'm describing is getting away from this draconian policy, as I see it, which is splitting up families, which is, the kind of hostile environment that saw, governments trying to send people back to countries that they'd not been to for decades. So I don't have any problem in saying that I'm perfectly happy to be an advocate for a humane immigration policy. And if that means numbers go up, to a relatively small extent, then I have absolutely no problem with that.
Okay, Chris, thank you. Michael has tweeted, well, at least somebody's enjoying the programme. One of the reasons I love radio as a medium is that it's the last place where decent civil political discussions take place. Unhurried, informative. Iain Dale talking to Caroline Lucas right now, and it's engrossing. So we're doing something right for Michael anyway. Let's see if we're doing something right for Crystal in Wembley Park. Hello, Crystal. Christoph, I beg your pardon.
I love Radio 2.
Marvellous. Radio 2? No, you love LBC. Go on.
So, Caroline, I'd like you to explain what I understand to be a Green Party policy, which is to support remaining in the EU, whilst at the same time supporting Scottish independence. Now, it seems to me that the rhetoric of campaigners for Scottish independence and for leaving the EU, much of the rhetoric is really indistinguishable. It talks about having control of our own laws. It talks about having different immigration, deciding our immigration policies and things like that. Is my understanding of that policy correct? And if so, can you explain what I think is a quite a big contradiction, another apparent contradiction in your policies?
That was a bit mean, just sticking in that another. I was kind of going along with you until you did that. Well, first of all, just a couple of points. The first point is just to be accurate. The Scottish Green Party is their own independent Scottish party. So we are the Party of England and Wales. So you're right to say that the policy of the Scottish Green Party is for independence. The policy of the Green Party of England and Wales, which I represent, is to say that it's up to the Scottish people to decide.
Well, I sense a bit of a split happening here. You don't really agree with your colleagues north of the border,
saying
do
that
you?
we don't think it's the role of the Green Party of England and Wales to say whether or not it's right for the Green Party of Scotland to decide whether, to leave or not. That's their decision. But we certainly think that it shouldn't be up to Westminster to decide whether or not that referendum can happen in Scotland. So we want to see people in Scotland given the right to decide whether or not they want independence, and our colleagues in Scotland are pro-independence.
Do you accept what Christoph is saying there, that there is a contradiction? And I've always thought this about the SNP, where they're so desperate to come out of the United Kingdom Union and yet want to stay in the European Union. If you want independence, I mean, that is their party name, they want independence. There is a bit of a contradiction there, surely.
Well, I do see what you mean, but I think one of the policies that the Green Party's had for a very long time, and it's not something that we've revisited recently, but I think it's actually very relevant, is talking about a Europe of the regions, by which we mean that you could have, for example, Scotland being its own independent country, but within a Europe of regions, so that it still has a partnership and a friendship and a cooperation at a European level, albeit not being part of the United Kingdom at the same time. So you're in a slightly wider union than just with the UK. So I don't think it's entirely illogical by any means, but I can certainly see the point that you're making.
Christoph, thank you very much. Do you want to have a quick comeback on that?
So shouldn't there be a Green Party of Wales?
Well, there are some people who would say that, yes. It gets regularly debated, I can promise you. And the Green Party of Cornwall, if it comes to that, but we won't go down there.
Oh, my goodness, we'll have the Green Party of Norfolk soon. Right, more questions for Caroline Lucas in just a second here on LBC. It's 8:46.
Here on LBC, Matt Fry, every Saturday morning from 10.
Tom Watson resigned. This isn't a great start to a campaign, is it?
So I think Tom thinks he's done a job, he's completed that job, and he now wants to do something else.
I'm sorry, but to suggest that Tom Watson has left the race because he's happy with the work that he's done and he's ready to go into retirement, I just don't buy that.
Leading Britain's conversation, Matt Fry on LBC.
Credit limit of up to £1,500. What do you have to do to get it? Simple. Get online and check if you're eligible for an Ocean credit card in minutes without affecting your credit score. For your Ocean credit card, visit ocean.co.uk now. and get all that from Ocean. Intelligent Lending Limited is a credit broker. Capital One, the exclusive lender. Representative 39.9% APR variable. Borrow and spend responsibly.
It's your Stand By Me station. Your You To Me Are Everything station. And, of course, your Easy Like a Sunday Morning station.
Easy like Sunday morning.
That's the sound of LBC's sister station, Smooth Radio. Listen on your radio, on Global Player, or ask your smart speaker to play Smooth.
In the trade, sign up to Wix Trade Pro and get 10% off every time you shop with no minimum spend. Download the app to register. Always cheaper with Wix Trade Pro. Terms apply.
At Esso, you can earn double Nectar points when you spend £5 or more on shop items. Esso Nectar, helping fuel your everyday. See esso.co.uk for exclusions.
For many sufferers of complex regional pain syndrome, life can be a living hell. If this is you, St Pancras Clinical Research would like to hear from you. We are conducting a new clinical research trial for CRPS at our comfortable clinic in central London. For more information, please go to stpancrasclinicalresearch.com. That's stpancrasclinicalresearch.com.
Money. How does that word make you feel? You might be thinking about what you'd love to spend it on, or what you have to spend it on. Maybe you think you're just bad with money. But here's the thing, you're not. You're just with the wrong bank. At Starling Bank, we want you to feel good about money. So we built a personal and business bank account with clever budgeting tools, instant payment alerts, and no fees when you spend overseas. Starling Bank, voted Britain's best bank twice. Download the app today. Smart Money People Awards. Eligibility criteria applies.
At Ring, we've reinvented the doorbell. So no matter where you are, or what time of day, you can watch over your home and the things you care about. Ring Video Doorbell streams HD video and two-way talk straight to your phone, so you can speak to whoever's at your door from anywhere.
Delivery.
Oh, great. Could you leave it with my neighbour, please?
Sure, no problem.
And it's so simple, you can install it yourself in minutes. See, hear and speak to whoever's at your door from wherever you are with Ring Video Doorbell. Available at ring.com and selected retailers.
Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:49. Caroline Lucas here, taking your calls, former leader of the Greens. I've incurred someone's eye because I described you as Westminster leader of the Greens. That is your title, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, okay, you're only one. Yeah, exactly. And you do a very good job of it too.
Thank you.
Right, let's go back to your calls. Dave is in Harlesden. Hello, Dave.
Hi.
What would you like to ask?
Well, I was thinking about asking Caroline why I've not heard them mention the fact that they're going to decriminalise possession of marijuana and accumulate tax from the sale of it, based on the examples in Los Angeles and Portugal.
Okay.
Good question. Well, because no one asked me, and because I guess it's not the priority right now in terms of our general election campaign, but the Green Party absolutely feels that prohibition of drugs isn't working, and that moving towards an evidence-based regulated approach is probably going to reduce harm. You point out that in some places as well, it also leads to significant tax revenues. But the bottom line is, I think, that we want an evidence-based drugs policy. And if you ever needed to see prohibition not working, then the number of people who are in prison because they've been trying to feed a drug habit and drug addiction is seen as a kind of a criminal offence rather than a health issue. I think we've got a real problem here. So the Green Party would absolutely advocate a step-by-step regulated approach, testing it out to see how it goes each way, but looking at the example of places like Portugal who have successfully moved in this direction and reduced the harm associated with drug use considerably.
But you also have a policy of making powdered cocaine available in fixed dosages at fixed prices to people who wish to use it.
Well, that's what I mean by having a regulated approach in a sense.
It's not a step-by-step approach. That is your policy to effectively legalise the taking of cocaine.
Well, I think what we would want to do is to look at the evidence that would suggest whether or not that would reduce harm. And I think the evidence that led to that... That's not what your
policy says on your website. I mean, I've got it here. DR408, a Green government will make powder cocaine available in fixed dosages at fixed prices to people who wish to use the drug for recreational purposes, for personal use only, through the specialist pharmacy model. I mean, that's a policy.
Okay. Well,
Were you unaware of that?
It changed at the last conference. You're reminding me that it has now changed at the last conference. And the argument behind that would be that right now, a lot of the harm that is linked to things like cocaine is because people don't actually know what's in it. There's lots of contaminants and impurities that actually cause some of the problems, and people don't know how strong it's going to be. If people are going to be taking drugs, then it's far better that they should, A, have to prove that they are, say, over 18 and don't have existing medical problems that it's going to exacerbate, and B, know that what they're taking is as safe as it can be. As obviously, it's not ever entirely safe, but I think the thinking behind this and the evidence that it's drawn on is the fact that when you have this in a regulated environment, it is safer than when you just don't quite know what you're taking and therefore quite often take too much and harms ensue.
Dave, thank you very much. A quick comeback from you.
Well, I was thinking of voting Green, but based on what I've just heard, I think,
So what bit don't you like, out of interest?
I didn't mention cocaine.
No,
that was
LA, but my point is, again, marijuana. We know that the skunk variety is the one that's responsible for making people's brains go bad or whatever. Right? But the old-fashioned traditional weeds, which older people like myself tend to imbibe in, doesn't do any harm at all.
But that's my point. That if you were to have, if you were to legalise cannabis, which we would, then you would know if it's in a regulated environment, you would know what you were buying, and you wouldn't then be taken in by people who are selling something that is far stronger than as you say, than it used to be, and often quite a lot stronger than people actually expect it to be, and that causes the harm. And what we want to do is to make sure people know what they're taking so that they can do their best to keep themselves safe.
Okay, Dave, thank you very much. Mike in Whitehaven, is Caroline a vegan? Given that global warming is mainly due to agricultural farming and cows, etc., are you a vegan?
Very, very nearly.
What does that mean?
It means
How
that
do you
it's
nearly be a vegan?
Well, I'm being honest.
You like a bit of beef burger occasionally?
I am absolutely a vegetarian, and I do my best to be vegan. Sometimes when you're out and about trying to grab food, in stations and so forth, there are times when cheese passes my mouth, and I'm not perfect.
Well,
but
there's nothing worse than vegan cheese.
You're right.
It's horrible, isn't it?
It
really
horrible.
is.
It really is horrible. But there's a serious point in that question, which is that I think it is important that we have a debate about our diets, and I think it is important that we shift away from eating so much meat and move to more plant-based diets because of the reasons that your caller suggested.
Right. Mike is in Camden. Hello, Mike. What would you like to ask?
Hello, Ian. Just a quick question there, Caroline. Do you think there's any way that we can use the corporation tax rates to encourage small companies to be more green conscious, more environmentally sustainable? I mean, for example, the Labour Party is talking about increasing it from corporation tax from 19% to 26%. I just wonder if you have any views around the corporate tax more so. I'm actually a small business owner, so I'm just interested in what the various parties' views are on that.
I mean, I think that small businesses right now, at least, looking at what's happening in Brighton, are really struggling, and that's a real combination between, business rates, corporation tax, Brexit. There's a whole set of things that are making life really difficult. And personally, I would like to look at ways of ensuring that while we might well be increasing corporation tax for the bigger companies, that we definitely, I think the idea of having lower corporation taxes for those small businesses that are, for example, able to shift in greener directions, that's exactly the kind of policy that hopefully isn't the stick that we were talking about a bit earlier in the programme, and is more of the carrot, and would help small businesses, because I think they get a pretty raw deal right now.
Mike, thank you. Luke in London says, I'd like to vote Green as I feel they have the most sensible policies, and Caroline Lucas puts them across really well. But in my area, it would be a wasted vote, as it would be in many areas. How does she plan on getting the Greens to the next step, on a par with the Lib Dems, for example?
Well, thank you. I mean, one of the ways is precisely through this Unite to Remain that we've been talking about. So, and again, I do stress the fact that it's a real, it's a real shame that we have to do this because it does deny people the right to vote Green in other places. But if by coming to some kind of arrangements, it means that the Lib Dems stand down in some constituencies in return for us doing the same, that will maximise our chances of getting elected. And the crucial thing is when we're doing that is that the people for whom we are standing aside are ones who have said that they will come back to Westminster if elected and fight for electoral reform. And, 1 million people voted Green in 2015. That should have given a rise to around 20 Green MPs. That would have been transformative. And my life would have been a lot less lonely. So we want to change the voting system. Until then, what we can try to do is work within this voting system by things like Unite to Remain. But it's deeply imperfect. And I look with such envy to the Green parties in so many other parts of Europe who are not only in parliaments but in governments, because I think the time is right now for the Green Party.
Is it a lonely existence in Parliament, being the sole Green?
It is. It is. she whined.
But do the other parties?
No, they are friendly. Of course they are, and there are lots of cross-party working, which is important. But nonetheless, it's not quite the same as having someone who's kind of from your own party, your own background, and from whom you can just share things. I sit on that opposition bench 9 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock at night, trying to cover everything. And as I sit there, I watch the Lib Dems and the Plaid Cymru, send their different spokespeople for the different issues. And I'm trying to be the expert on the whole bloody lot. I mean, it's just exhausting. So just being able to share that with a few other people would be awfully nice.
Was there part of you, when this election was called, was there part of you that thought, I see a lot of people standing down in this election. Was there a temptation for you to do the same and just have a nicer life?
No, because I just think it is so. Well, it is exhausting. I mean, I promise you. And when I was elected in 2010, which is almost 10 years ago, I genuinely thought that either in 2015 or the election after that, there would be more Greens alongside me by now, and it's taking longer than I'd hoped. So the sigh was just a recognition of the fact that it is really hard work, and it is really tough when you're trying to cover everything on your own. But no, I think it is so important to keep that Green voice there, and hopefully, at this next election, get some Green colleagues alongside.
Right, let's do a quick final call from Steve in Marlborough. Steve, can you be very quick with your question, please?
Caroline, I just wonder whether or not the Green Party understand the impact of electric vehicles. A Tesla Type 90 produces 10.9 tonnes of CO2 during its production, including the shipping of the raw materials you've mentioned during the nuclear debate. Its disposal hasn't even been calculated. A 1.2 Fiat Panda petrol lean burn produces 1.8 tonnes of carbon during its production. They are not green. Thoughts?
My thought is you've obviously done your research on this. I mean, I would say two things about that. First, that unlike some parties, we don't see electric vehicles as some kind of panacea. We see public transport as the thing we really want to invest in. Yes, of course, it's far better that a car is an electric vehicle than a fossil fuel vehicle, but what you've kind of described, I think, points to two things. One, that we need to make sure that the life of these vehicles is as long as possible. And two, at the end of their lives, we need to make sure that we are using every single part of that vehicle to reuse it so that we don't have so much material throughput. Because you are right to point out that every time you build a new car, you're using massive amounts of raw materials and emissions, whether that car is, ultimately fueled by fossil fuels or by electricity.
Steve, thank you very much indeed for that. Final text from Cindy. I quite like Caroline. As well as being politically savvy, she sounds like someone whose company I would enjoy.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed your company for the last hour. I hope our listeners have too. And thank you so much for coming in. If you would like to hear it all again, or maybe you tuned in a little bit late, it'll be up on the Cross Question podcast within the hour, and you can watch it again on YouTube as well. So Caroline Lucas, thank you very much indeed. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 1 minute past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, opposition parties have criticised latest healthcare figures which show A&E performance in England is at its worst level recorded since records began 15 years ago. Last month, 1 in 6 patients had to wait longer than 4 hours before they were seen. The Liberal Democrats say it shows the